It was just supper. But for her, it was the first time in years someone had set a plate in front of her and sat down across from her like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She looked at him but for her, it was the first time in years. The Elkhorn Community Hall sat on a slight rise at the west end of town, a squared-off timber building with a pitched roof and 12 narrow windows that let in light, but not much warmth. Every first Saturday of the month, the women of Elkhorn, Montana brought what they had: bean soup, salt pork, biscuits, dried apple cake. And the men brought themselves, and the hall filled with the particular noise of people who see each other too often to be strangers and not often enough to be honest. Nora Alden always arrived last. Not late, last. There is a difference. Late means you misjudged the time. Last means you waited until the crowd had settled, until the benches were mostly claimed and the conversations had started without you, so that walking in required nothing of anyone. She came through the side door, the one nearest the woodpile, wearing the same faded sage-green cotton dress with its small bone buttons down the front, a brown wool shawl pulled across her shoulders, and a flour-dusted canvas apron she had not removed because removing it would have meant she was dressing for something. Her dark auburn hair fell in a single thick braid over her left shoulder, secured at the end with a strip of rawhide. At her collar, a brass thimble hung on a thin leather cord, catching the lamplight when she moved. The birthmark on the left side of her neck, just below her ear, small and faint, was the kind of detail you would only notice if you were already looking at her closely. Nobody was. She was 34 years old. She had been running 320 acres alone for 4 years. Her husband, James, had died in the winter of 1878 when a bay gelding threw him on frozen ground and his skull hit a fence post at the wrong angle. And the town had watched her that first spring the way you watch a candle in a draft, waiting for the flicker, the gutter, the dark. But Nora Alden did not go out. She made her property tax payment of $47 on time. She sold her pies at 75 cents each. She kept her cattle count accurate in a leather-bound ledger that was soft at the edges and dusted with flour. And after a while, the town stopped watching. They categorized her. Managing. Not in trouble. Not asking for help. Invisible. At every supper she sat at the end of the last table, the one closest to the far wall and farthest from the stove. She ate what she had brought. She spoke to no one. Other women filled plates for their husbands, their neighbors, the pastor. Men carried cups of coffee to the women who had cooked. There was a quiet economy of gesture in that hall. Who poured for whom? Who made room on a bench? And it told you everything about who mattered to whom if you knew how to read it. No one poured for Nora. No one sat across from her. The seat was always empty, and the empty seat had become as fixed as the stove itself. 7 weeks before this particular Saturday, a man had come to Elkhorn. Caleb Dane. 48 years old. No land. No family anyone had met. He had arrived with a dark charcoal wool coat over a cream-colored cotton shirt with no collar, dusty black leather work boots with square toes, and a tarnished brass pocket watch on a short chain looped from his left coat pocket to a buttonhole. His hair was dark brown, streaked with gray at the temples, parted roughly to the right. His eyes were deep brown and heavy-lidded, and he had a way of leaning slightly forward when someone spoke to him, as though their words deserved the weight of his full attention. He worked day wages, mending fences, patching barn siding, clearing deadfall, for whoever would hire him. He was quiet. He was competent. He was nobody. He knew only one thing about the woman at the end of the last table, and it was this. The seat across from her was the only empty one in the hall. So he sat down. But first, and this is the part that mattered, though he did not know it, he had gone through the supper line, and because the line was right there and his hands were not full, he filled 2 plates. Not because he knew her, not because he had noticed the braid or the thimble or the 4 years of empty chairs. He filled 2 plates because there was a woman sitting at a table with nothing in front of her, and it seemed like a simple enough thing to fix. He set the plate down across from her. Beans, a biscuit, a cut of salt pork. He sat. He said nothing. She looked at him and said something so quiet the people nearest them almost missed it. "Nobody's done that since my husband died." Caleb Dane had no idea what that sentence weighed. He had no sense of the 4 years packed into it, the Saturday nights of sitting alone, the economy of gestures that had excluded her so completely that a plate of beans from a stranger was enough to stop her hands in her lap. He nodded once, thumbs hooked into his suspenders, and began to eat. 3 tables away, Ruth Ames sat with her carved walking stick propped against the bench beside her, its dark wood handle smooth and darkened with age. She was 71 years old, silver-white hair pulled into a tight, low bun, pale blue eyes sharp and clear, a small cameo brooch pinned at the high collar of her dark navy dress. She had watched the whole thing. The plate, the whisper, the nod. She said nothing to anyone that night, but her eyes stayed on that far table for a long time, and her thin fingers rested on the handle of her walking stick, and she noted it. Before we go on, I want to know, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. I like knowing where this story travels. Now, the reason I mention that is because of what happened after everyone else stood up and left. The hall emptied the way it always did, benches scraping, coats pulled on, voices trailing out into the cold. Lanterns were turned down one by one. Caleb Dane had finished his supper, set his fork down, nodded once, and walked out into the cold without looking back. And Nora Alden sat at that table for 11 minutes after everyone else had gone. The following Tuesday, Nora Alden's fence gave way in the northeast quarter. 3 posts heaved out of half-frozen clay like the earth had simply decided to let go. Now let me tell you about this woman's land before I tell you what happened on it. 320 acres in the Elkhorn Valley, running east from Cutter Creek to the granite ridge that split the Shaw property from hers. 41 head of cattle she fed and counted herself, every morning, every evening, standing at the gate with her breath fogging in the cold and her gray-green eyes tracking each animal like she was reading a ledger with legs. And speaking of ledgers, hers sat on the kitchen table at all times, leather-bound, flour-dusted at the corners, the spine soft from use. Every number that mattered lived in that book. Hay purchased, 14 tons at $11.40 per ton from Ridley's Supply in September. Wire, 8 cents per foot, and she knew that price the way most people know their own name, to the 10th of a cent, without hesitation, without having to look it up. Property tax due March 1st, $47. She had counted out the money twice already, in January, sitting at that table by lantern light with the coins and bills laid flat. She made every payment on time. She had made every payment on time for 11 years. And she did not discuss this with anyone, because it was not anyone's business, and because the numbers spoke for themselves. That morning, she walked the northeast line alone. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees the night before, and the ground had done what half-clay ground does when the frost goes deep. It pushed. 3 posts, cedar, each one originally set 28 inches down, had risen 4 to 6 inches out of the earth. The clay had expanded around them, frozen, then released, and the posts stood at angles that would have been almost comical if they hadn't been holding wire. The wire itself had sagged into long silver smiles between the leaning posts, but hadn't snapped. Good wire holds tension even when the geometry betrays it. Nora walked the line slowly, her dark auburn braid falling over her left shoulder, the brass thimble on its leather cord catching light at her collar. She pressed her palm flat against each wire strand, felt for the give, felt for the hum of tension that tells you the wire still remembers where it's supposed to be. 2 strands held. The bottom strand had gone slack enough that a determined calf could push under it. She stood back and looked at the damage the way you look at a bill you expected but hoped would come later. That is when Caleb Dane rode past on the valley road. He was not looking for work. He was not looking for her. He was passing through on the same road he'd ridden 6 times in the last month, heading north toward the timber claims above Harlan's Creek, his tarnished brass pocket watch chain catching against the buttonhole of his dark charcoal coat every time the horse shifted gait. But a man who has spent 30 years around fences does not ride past 3 downed posts without seeing them. His deep brown eyes tracked the damage from the road, the lean of the posts, the sag of the wire, the woman standing alone with her hands at her sides, assessing what needed doing. He did not ask permission. He tied his horse to the gatepost, pulled an iron bar from behind his saddle, the kind of bar you carry when you know what clay does in winter, and walked to the first post without a word. Here is how you dig a post hole in half-clay soil, and I want you to understand this, because this is where the whole damn story lives. You do not use a spade. A spade will bounce off frozen clay like you're hitting stone, and even in thawed clay, it will grab and stick and make you feel like you're fighting the earth itself. You use a bar, a digging bar, 5 feet long, 15 pounds of iron with a chisel point. You drive it straight down with both hands, twisting as it bites, because clay grabs. It closes around the bar like a fist, and you have to break that grip with a quarter turn on every stroke. Caleb drove the bar down in steady strikes, his broad shoulders squaring with each impact, his cream-colored shirt darkening with sweat at the collar despite the cold. The hole needed to be 30 inches minimum. Not 28, that was what had failed. 30 inches puts the base below the frost line in this valley, and you pack it in layers. Gravel first, 2 inches, to give water somewhere to go instead of freezing around the post. Then clay, tamped with the flat end of the bar in 3-inch lifts. Then gravel again. Then clay again, boot-stamped this time, your full weight driving down on each layer until it doesn't give anymore. You do not pack it all at once. You do not pour in loose fill and hope. Each layer is a decision, and each decision holds or fails independently. Nora appeared at the fence line. She did not thank him. She did not object. She watched him set the first post, watched him tamp the first layer, and then she picked up the second post, still muddy from where the ground had spit it out, and walked 10 feet down the line and started her own hole. Her own bar, her own rhythm. They worked in parallel silence, the only sound the ring of iron on frozen ground and the occasional scrape of gravel being raked into a hole. Caleb finished his first post. Plumb. Solid. He moved to the second and set it faster. Maybe too fast. maybe trusting the rhythm more than the level. He tamped the layers, packed the clay, stepped back. She corrected his angle on the second post without looking up from the wire she was threading, and Caleb Dane pulled the post, redug the hole, and reset it without a word. And that was the moment something shifted that neither of them would have been able to name. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened over the next 6 weeks, and what the town of Elkhorn made of it. See, a town like Elkhorn doesn't gossip the way you think it does. It doesn't need to. It has a general store. And a general store in a valley of 400 souls is better than any newspaper because it doesn't print what happened. It records what people buy. And what people buy tells you everything about how they're living. Nora Alden had been buying 1 pound of coffee every 3 weeks for 11 years. 1 pound. Same brand, same tin. The shopkeeper, a man named Hadley, who had memorized every household's rhythm the way a doctor memorizes a pulse, noted the purchase each time in his own ledger. Not because anyone asked, but because that was what Hadley did. He tracked the valley. 1 pound every 3 weeks. That was the number of a woman drinking alone. In September, Nora bought 2 pounds in 2 weeks. Hadley didn't say a word. He weighed the beans, wrote the figure, slid the tin across the counter, and watched her walk out with the brass thimble catching light at her collar. He said nothing on Sunday either, when the church supper tables were arranged in the long hall and Nora sat in her usual place. 3rd table, far end, the seat that faced the wall. And Caleb Dane sat across from her again. This time, he did not need to explain it. The first Sunday, someone might have asked. The second Sunday, someone might have wondered. By the 3rd Sunday, the valley had simply absorbed the fact and folded it into its understanding of the world, the way soil absorbs rain. Silently, completely, without comment until something grows. Every eye tracked it. Nobody spoke. Now let me tell you about Everett Shaw, because you need to understand what Nora was turning down to understand what she was choosing. Everett Shaw owned 480 acres adjoining Nora's property to the south. Good land, creek-fed. He was 30 years old, lean and clean-shaven, with sandy blonde hair parted neatly to the left and hazel-green eyes that caught light in a way women in Elkhorn had noticed and men in Elkhorn had resented. He wore polished brown riding boots without a scuff on them, and he carried a new leather-bound ledger under his arm everywhere he went. The spine unstressed, the pages clean, because Everett Shaw was a man whose plans hadn't been tested yet, and who therefore believed all plans worked. He was not a bad man. I want you to hear that clearly. He had good land, good teeth, a reasonable proposal, and absolutely no understanding of what he was walking into. His offer to Nora was simple and, on paper, generous. Merge the properties, share the herd, split the tax burden. 640 acres combined, enough to negotiate better prices in Miles City, enough to survive any winter. He had brought this proposal to Nora twice. She had said, "I'll think about it," both times. Her gray-green eyes level, her hands still at her sides. The conversation closed like a door on a latch. Everett interpreted this as progress. Bless his heart. The 3rd time Everett rode north, he found Caleb Dane setting posts along Nora's northeast fence line. He slowed his horse. He sat the saddle for a long moment, watching. Then he rode over, swung down, and tested a post with his hand, gripped it and pressed. The post didn't move, not a quarter inch. He looked at Caleb. Charcoal wool coat, cream shirt with no collar, tarnished brass watch chain looped to the buttonhole. A man with no land, no herd, no deed, no stake. Everett's eyes performed an inventory so thorough, it might as well have been an audit. He noted the suspenders, the square-toed boots, the gray at the temples. He calculated the gap, in age, in acres, in every currency that Everett Shaw believed the world ran on. He nodded once and rode on. But that nod wasn't respect. That nod was a man counting another man's nothing and dismissing it. 3 mornings later, Caleb walked to the northeast quarter at first light to resume the fence line. Sitting on the top rail of the new fence was a biscuit wrapped in cloth. Still warm. He could feel the heat through the flour sacking before he touched it. The cloth was hemmed with small, tight stitches, precise even, the work of someone whose hands did not waste thread. The biscuit itself was golden on top and slightly crisp on the bottom, where it had sat against the cast iron. Flour cut with lard, buttermilk folded in, baked in a skillet with a lid on so the steam would hold the rise. He ate it standing at the fence without looking toward the house. The coffee in his own tin cup was cold. The biscuit was perfect. Before we go on, I want to know, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. I always read them. Now, the barn. The east wall of Nora's barn had a section of planking that had been soft since spring. Caleb pressed a knife tip into the lowest board. The blade sank past a quarter inch without resistance, past half an inch. The wood was gone. Not cracked, not weathered, but rotted from the inside. The grain dark and wet and fibrous as old bread. He pulled 3 boards. The frame timber behind them was worse. He pressed the knife again. It sank to the handle. You sister a new board against a weakened frame timber by cutting your replacement from standing deadfall pine, dry wood already seasoned by wind and altitude. You notch the end with a chisel so it seats into the sill. Then you brace it diagonal, toe-nailed with cut nails at opposing angles, so the load transfers clean. The first board Caleb sistered split along a hidden check in the grain, a crack that ran the length of the timber beneath the bark, invisible until stress found it. He pulled it, selected a new board, checked the grain by flexing it across his knee, re-notched. Nora appeared at his elbow and handed him the chisel without being asked, the way you hand someone a word they're reaching for in conversation. Ruth Ames was in the general store that afternoon. She had been watching for 6 weeks. She stood at the counter with her carved walking stick dark with age, her pale blue eyes sharp and clear beneath thin arched eyebrows, the cameo brooch at her throat catching the late September light. Hadley was marking his ledger. Ruth Ames set down her coffee cup, looked at the young woman behind the counter, and said, "She hasn't made 2 cups since James." And then she picked up her walking stick and left the store without buying anything. By October, the valley had turned the color of old brass, and the old-timers were reading the sky the way they read scripture, with fear and certainty in equal measure. The door of the general store hadn't even finished closing behind Ruth Ames and her carved walking stick before the weight of what she'd said settled into the room like wood smoke. Nobody repeated it. Nobody had to. The girl behind the counter wiped down a surface that was already clean, and the two men by the nail bins found something fascinating about their own boots. But here's the thing about a valley like that. Words like Ruth's don't stay indoors. They travel on the wind, on the nod between neighbors, on the silence that falls when Nora Alden's name comes up at the church supper. And while the town was busy not talking about 2 cups of coffee, Nora was sitting at her kitchen table doing something far more dangerous than gossip. She was telling herself the truth. In numbers. The ledger sat open under the lamplight. Leather cover worn soft at the edges, flour dusted along the spine from weeks of being pushed aside during baking and pulled back during the quiet hours after dark. The handwriting inside was small and precise, not decorative, not performative, just exact. Every letter pressed into the page with the same even pressure, the way a woman writes when she knows no one will read it but her and God and the tax collector. 41 cattle, 14 tons of hay, 6 cords of firewood split and stacked. Property tax due March 1st, $47. Cash in the coffee tin on the second shelf, $39. She had counted it 4 times by lantern light. 4 times. Because the number didn't change, but she kept hoping the act of counting would somehow produce $8 more from the air. It did not. $39 is $39 whether you count it once or 100 times. The gap between 39 and 47 is $8, and $8 in October might as well be $800 if the winter comes early and the pies stop selling. She wrote the number down again. 39. Then she closed the ledger and set her hands flat on the table, her gray-green eyes fixed on the dark window, the brass thimble on its leather cord catching the lamplight at her collar. Now, the hay. Most folks in the valley stacked their hay on bare ground. Cheaper, faster, and for 3 seasons out of 4, it held just fine. But Nora had watched what happened to ground-stacked hay in a hard winter. Moisture wicks up from the frozen earth. It starts at the bottom, invisible, patient. By December, the lowest bales are damp. By January, the center of the stack is hot to the touch, the mold working through it like a slow fever. And by February, you're feeding cattle hay that smells sweet and wrong and makes them sick. You lose hay. Then you lose cattle. Then you lose the ranch. So she built a crib. Pine poles, 8 of them, laid crosswise on flat stones to keep the wood off the dirt. Then a second layer perpendicular to create a platform that held the hay a full 10 inches above the ground. Air could move underneath. Moisture had nowhere to climb. She set the first 6 poles herself over 2 days, measuring the spacing by hand. A forearm's width between each pole, no more, no less, so the hay wouldn't sag and defeat the purpose. The last 2 poles were 12 feet long and green, heavier than the others because they hadn't seasoned yet. She was wrestling the 7th into position when Caleb Dane appeared at the edge of the hay yard. He didn't announce himself. He just walked over, took the far end of the pole, and held it level while she shimmed the stone beneath it. They set the 8th pole the same way. He tested the platform by pressing down on the center with both hands, his tarnished brass watch chain swinging from the buttonhole of his charcoal coat. The crib held. He nodded once, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and walked back toward the road. They did not discuss this. Not then, not later. 3 days after the hay crib was finished, Everett Shaw rode up to her porch. New leather ledger under his arm, spine still uncracked, pages still clean. polished brown riding boots that had never once been muddied past the ankle. He had a new offer, and he delivered it the way he delivered everything, like a man handing down a gift from a height. $47. He would pay her property tax outright. No strings, he said. No expectations. Just one neighbor helping another. And the dimple in his left cheek appeared when he said it, because Everett Shaw genuinely believed he was being generous. That was the worst part. He wasn't lying. He simply could not fathom why anyone would choose hard over easy, when easy was standing right there in polished boots, with a brass belt buckle and good teeth, and 480 acres of prime grazing land. Nora stood on her porch in her faded sage-green dress, her dark auburn braid over her left shoulder, and said 5 words. "The farm is not for sale." He started to explain that it wasn't about the farm. She cut him off with 3 more. "I'm managing." He left. He wasn't angry. He was confused, deeply, honestly confused. And confusion in a man like Everett is more dangerous than anger, because anger passes, but confusion festers. He rode away down the valley road looking like a man who'd been handed a math problem where the numbers don't work. 3 days later, the barometer at the general store began to fall. It fell for 3 days straight. The old-timers gathered by the stove and said it would be the worst winter in 11 years. Nora opened her ledger that night. 14 tons of hay on a raised crib, 6 cords of wood, barn patched, fence line holding. She wrote the numbers down again, each one a small prayer in ink. She did not write down what she was afraid of. If this story is keeping you company tonight, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, the reason I tell you about that wood is because of what the next 72 hours did to every ranch in the valley. The storm came in from the north on a Tuesday. Wind first, then snow so thick you couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window. Temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. Nora banked her stove, checked the barn latch twice, and went to bed with her boots on. She woke at 1 in the morning to the sound of an axe. It came through the wall, distant, rhythmic, steady. Steel biting into frozen wood with that particular high crack that green timber makes when the temperature has dropped below 0 and the sap has turned to glass inside the grain. Someone was splitting wood. Not on her property, near it, close enough to hear, far enough that whoever it was had not come to her door. She lay in the dark and listened. The splitting had a pattern. 3 strikes, a pause to set the next round, 3 strikes again. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Whoever was swinging that axe had been corrected once on his stance and had never needed correcting again. She did not go outside. She pulled the quilt to her chin, her gray-green eyes open in the dark, and she listened for 2 hours. The rhythm never broke. The axe never missed. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, with the wind tearing at the roof and the barn groaning like a ship, Nora Alden opened her kitchen door and found 4 cords of split wood stacked against the house wall, still smelling of fresh cedar and lantern oil. And the tracks in the snow leading away from her door were already filling in. The killing storm lasted 3 days and took everything that wasn't built right. By dawn of the first full day, the wind had stopped sounding like wind and started sounding like something with intentions. It came from the northeast, which meant it hit the barn broadside, which meant the patch mattered. Nora pressed her palm flat against the inside wall of the barn where the new boards met the old frame. She held it there. 1 second. 5. 10. Her skin stayed warm. The seal was holding. Cold air finds gaps the way water finds cracks. It doesn't negotiate, it just goes. And this wall wasn't offering any. She pulled her hand back and looked at the hay on the raised crib. Dry. Every bale she could reach. Dry. She'd built that crib 18 inches off the ground with salvaged railroad ties, and people had opinions about that, sure. Her neighbor Frank Lassiter had stacked his hay on bare earth because that's how his father did it, and that's how he'd always done it. By the second morning of the storm, Frank's hay was pulling moisture from the frozen ground through capillary action. The bottom bales dark and warm with the kind of warmth that means rot, not heat. Nora didn't know this yet. She'd learn it after. The narrator mentions it not to be cruel to Frank, just to be precise. The fence line told two stories. Along the northeast quarter, every post Caleb Dane had reset stood plumb and firm, the wire singing tight in the wind but not shifting. The tamped layers of clay and gravel locked like mortar around the base. Good work holds. That's not poetry. That's physics. But the south quarter, a section Nora had set alone 2 years ago, before she understood what half-clay soil does when it freezes and thaws through consecutive seasons. That section shifted. She saw it from the kitchen window on the second morning. 2 posts leaning maybe 4 degrees east. Doesn't sound like much. 4 degrees is how you lose cattle. She heated an iron bar on the stove for 20 minutes until the tip glowed dull orange. She wrapped the handle end in wet burlap, pulled on every layer she owned, and walked into the storm. Now here's what resetting a post in frozen ground during a blizzard actually looks like. The frost layer in Montana in January goes down 14 to 18 inches. You can't dig through it. You can't persuade it. You drive the heated bar straight down beside the post, and the iron melts a channel through the frost, and you work the bar in a circle to loosen the grip. Then you pull the post, widen the hole, and reset it plumb. But you can't pack clay, because the clay is frozen solid somewhere in a pile that might as well be concrete. So you pack what you have. Snow and gravel, layered, tamped hard with your boot, knowing it'll hold for the storm, but you'll need to redo it in spring with proper fill. You work by feel because you can't see the bubble level through ice on the glass. You work by memory of what Caleb's hands looked like when he showed you the angle. She was driving the bar into the second post hole when she saw him come out of the white. Caleb Dane had been in a line shack 2 miles north. No cattle of his own, no property to protect. He could have sat by that iron stove and waited 3 days, and nobody would have thought less of him. Nobody would have known. That's the whole point, isn't it? What a man does when nothing is owed and nobody is watching. He rode through horizontal snow because he knew which section she'd set alone. He didn't speak. He took the bar from her hands, the only time he ever took anything from her, and drove the post while she held the wire taut with both fists, leaning back against the wind. They worked in darkness, cut only by snow so thick it seemed to glow. When the second post was set, he tested the wire with his palm, pressing flat, feeling for the right give. He nodded once. They walked back to the house without a word. Firewood consumed versus projected. Nora had written it in the ledger. 4 cords for 72 hours. She burned 5. That extra cord, the one Caleb split at 3 in the morning, the one she found stacked against her wall smelling of cedar and lantern oil, was the difference between the fire holding and the fire going out. The math doesn't need commentary. 4 is less than 5. The morning after, the storm broke like a fever. Nora counted cattle. 41. All accounted for. She checked the barn. The patch held. Checked the hay. Dry. She opened the flour-dusted leather ledger, its edges worn soft, and wrote the numbers down. Her hand was steady. 2 days later, a county livestock inspector rode through. Gray-haired man who smelled like tobacco and said less than Caleb. He checked fence tension by pressing his palm flat against the wire. He felt the hay for moisture, crumbling a handful between his fingers and smelling it. He read Nora's ledger, turning pages slowly, running his thumb down the columns. He counted cattle. He did not praise. He said, "Your operation is sound." He wrote a number in his own book and rode on. That sentence was worth more than anything Everett Shaw ever offered. And then, the kitchen. Nora baking. Cold butter cut with 2 knives until it looked like rough gravel. Ice water added 1 tablespoon at a time. The dough pressed, never kneaded. You knead bread. You press pie crust. And if you confuse the two, you get leather. Rolled on a floured board. Winesap apples sliced a 1/4 inch thin, layered in the dish. Lattice woven, not laid. Each strip threaded over and under, lifted and replaced, patient as quilting. Cream brushed on the top crust with her fingertips. Raw sugar dusted from a jar. Caleb was at the table, the tarnished brass watch chain catching lantern light. He'd been sitting there 20 minutes. Neither had spoken. She set a cup of coffee in front of him, the second cup, the one that had been appearing for weeks. He wrapped his hands around it. She said, "Stay." He said, "Yes." And that was the climax of everything that had been building since a plate of food at a community supper. Caleb Dane looked at Nora Alden across a kitchen table covered in flour and lantern light, and she said one word, "Stay." And he said one word back. And that was the climax of everything that had been building since a plate of food at a community supper. The town of Elkhorn did not discuss what had happened at the Alden Ranch. They did not need to. The evidence was in the fence line. 3 weeks after the storm broke, Everett Shaw rode north. He came on a Tuesday morning, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. His polished brown riding boots were muddied to the ankle. That new leather-bound ledger he always carried under his arm was absent. His hazel-green eyes moved across the property the way a man reads a document he does not want to sign. He stopped his horse at the south fence first. The line ran straight and true across the frozen meadow, every cedar post standing plumb, every wire singing with the right tension. He dismounted. He walked to the nearest post, the one Caleb had reset during the blizzard with frozen hands and a lantern swinging from a nail. Everett Shaw wrapped his hand around that post and pushed. It did not move. Not a 1/4 inch. Not a fraction. He pushed again, harder this time, leaning his weight into it the way you test something you need to fail. It did not move. He looked toward the barn, the patch on the northwest wall, the one Caleb had rebuilt with overlapping boards and 16-penny nails driven at alternating angles, held flush against the framing. No daylight through the seams. No buckle. No separation. He looked at the hay crib next to the barn, raised 18 inches off the ground on stacked riverstone, the bales dry and gold and full, covered with canvas weighted at the corners. Here is what the narrator knows, and Everett Shaw knew that morning. His own hay spoiled. Stacked against the ground on his fine property with his good land and his good teeth. And the melt got into it from below, and the weight compressed it from above, and the whole pile went to rot in 9 days. Half his south fence went down, posts set by hired men who were paid by the day, not by the result. Posts set in topsoil without clay packing. posts that leaned and then fell and then let the wire go slack. He lost 9 head through those gaps. 9 cattle worth $11 each wandering into a white nothing because the fence that was supposed to hold them was built by men who did not love the land they were building on. Everett Shaw stood in Nora Alden's yard and looked at what had survived. He looked at it for a long time. Then he nodded once. One single nod, slow and deliberate, chin dropping and rising. That nod was the town's verdict. He did not apologize. He did not offer to buy the property again. He did not say a damn word about how a woman could not hold land alone, or how the place needed a man's name on the deed. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode south toward his own broken fences, and his spoiled hay, and his 99 cattle where there should have been 108. The dimple in his left cheek did not show. His expression did not shift enough to find it. Weeks later, Ruth Ames stood in the general store leaning on that carved walking stick dark with age. Her silver-white hair pulled tight in its low bun, her pale blue eyes tracking everything the way they always did. Someone, it does not matter who, mentioned that Caleb Dane was still at the Alden place, still there after the storm, still there after the thaw, still splitting wood and mending wire and sitting at a table where 2 cups of coffee appeared every morning without anyone asking. Ruth adjusted her grip on the walking stick. She looked at no one in particular and said, "He said yes," before she finished the sentence. She bought her coffee. 1.5 pounds of dark roast, the same as always. She left. She said nothing else for the rest of this story, because she had already said everything that needed saying across 3 sentences spread over 13 months. And Ruth Ames was not a woman who wasted words on people who were not listening. Now, the narrator owes you something. The 2 cups of coffee by the stove every morning. The biscuit wrapped in cloth left on a fence post. The cedar posts appearing by a gate at 3 in the morning, still smelling of fresh-cut wood and lantern oil. The wood split at hours when no sane person is awake. The post she corrected on his 2nd day that he never set wrong again. The iron bar taken from her hands in a blizzard when her grip failed and her body was giving out, but her pride was not. None of it was charity. None of it was obligation. None of it was a good neighbor being a good neighbor. It was the only language either of them had left, and they had been speaking it fluently for months before either one had the courage to call it by its name. They married in the community hall on a Thursday in late spring, small and quiet. The same room where he had first filled a plate and carried it to the end of a table. The brass thimble on its leather cord hung at her collar above a dress that was not new but was clean and pressed, and hers. The tarnished brass pocket watch sat in his left coat pocket, the chain looped to the buttonhole the way it always was. The 320 acres carried no mortgage. The ledger on the kitchen table, flour-dusted, leather-bound, worn soft at the edges, now tracked 2 names worth of numbers. Hay fed, wood burned, payments made, cattle counted. All in the same steady hand because Nora still kept the books, and Caleb never once asked to. Years passed. A porch at sunset. 2 rocking chairs that had been 1 rocking chair for 11 years before that. A hand held in the evening light, his broad palm over her small freckled knuckles, neither of them gripping, just resting. The way you hold something you are no longer afraid of losing. And then a community supper, years later. The hall full and warm and loud with conversation. Nora sitting at the same long table, not at the end anymore, in the middle, with Caleb across from her. His deep brown eyes heavy-lidded and calm, thumbs hooked in his suspenders. A young woman sat alone at the far end of the table, Her plate was empty. She was looking at her hands. Caleb stood. He walked to the serving table. He filled a plate, roast beef, bread, beans, a wedge of pie, and he carried it to the end of the table and set it down in front of her without a word. Nora watched him do it, her gray-green eyes steady, the brass thimble catching the lamplight at her collar. She did not speak. She did not need to. The gesture was the whole story, passed forward like a hymn sung from memory. If you stayed with me through all of that, I want you to know it meant something. The story was the pie. You staying was the second cup of coffee. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep writing.